بكت عيني بكت عيني بكت عيني على ذنبي وما لاقيت من كربي، فيا ذلي ويا خجلي إذا ما قال لي ربي أما استحييت تعصيني ولا تخشى من العتب.
We begin by praising Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the one and the unique. It is He alone that we worship, and it is His aid that we seek. It is who revealed the Quran to the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and He taught Adam how to speak. So may salat and salam be upon the one who was sent to embody the prophetic peak. As to what follows, there is an interesting narration of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam in Sahih Imam al-Bukhari. He tells us a story of the past. He says, in the days gone by, in the previous nations, there was a monk, in the Christian times, there was a monk who would worship God in his seminary, in his monastery. And in those days, the monasteries were away from society, and it was not allowed for women to enter the monastery. So, this monk, his name was George. And George's mother went to the monastery outside and said, "Oh George, I need some help, can you come out to help me?" And George was in salah. So he said to Allah, "Ya Rabb, between the salah and between my mother, what should I choose?" So he chose the salah and continued praying. The next day his mother came again. He's a hermit, he's a monk. He's not allowed to, he's in the monastery, worshipping 24/7, fasting, whatever they do in the monastery. Next day his mother came, the same story, he was in salah. He said, "Ya Rabb, between the salah, between my mother, what should I do?" He chose, once again, the salah. The third day his mother came and the same story. Then his mother got angry at him and said, "Oh Allah, may you punish Jurayj by humiliating him with the evil ladies, the prostitutes. May his reputation be tarnished with them." And she walked away angry. It so happened that that type of lady became pregnant, and she became pregnant by a particular person in the community. But when she was challenged, she goes, "Oh no, it was Jurayj." She lied. It was Jurayj. He's the one who impregnated me. And so the people became so incensed. They said, "What? The monk, the hermit, the one who's supposed to be worshipping God?" They went to his monastery while he was praying. This time they interrupted, they didn't ask permission. They broke down the monastery, they dragged him out, beating and whatnot, and they took him to the town center. And he said, "What is the issue? What's going on?" They explained the story, and he remembered the dua of his mother, because he heard the dua outside. He remembered the dua of his mother, and he smiled while they were beating him, because this is Allah responding to the dua of my mother. So he said, "Before you kill me, let me pray 2 rak'at." He prayed 2 rak'at, and he made dua to Allah to show a miracle. So he pointed to the baby, and he said, "Who is your father?" And the baby said, "So-and-so is my father, not you. So-and-so is my father." So the townspeople witnessed the miracle. Our Prophet said only 3 spoke from the cradle: Jesus, the son of Mary, the child that was in the story of Jurayj, and then the daughter or the son of the home smith of Asiya, the wife of Fir'aun. So 3 people spoke from the cradle. Now, this narration, Imam al-Nawawi and Ibn Hajar, they comment on it, and they say, in one version, the Prophet ﷺ added, "May Allah have mercy on Jurayj, on Jurayj. If he had knowledge, he would have responded to his mother." If he had knowledge, he would have responded to his mother. I began my talk with this story because it really embodies some of the potential dangers of an innocent understanding of what religion is. When you think something is religious and you are committed to that understanding, tragedy could result. In fact, we have an incident in the seerah of the Prophet ﷺ that in one of the expeditions, a soldier became injured and his wound was in the head, it was festering. And the journey back would take weeks, as you know. And so on the way back, the soldier, his wound was festering, he went to sleep and he woke up in a state of janaba. He said to his colleagues, "What do I do now? What do I do now? I'm in the state of janaba, but I can't touch water." So one of them said, "Oh, you know the sharia, you know what the fiqh says. If you're in janaba, you cannot pray Fajr without doing wudu. You have to go in the cold and do wudu. So he did, he did ghusl. He did ghusl, he poured water on his head, and that festered the wound. It caused the entire body to become gangrene, and he died before reaching Medina. When they came back, they told the news to the Prophet ﷺ. He became so angry, his face became red. And he said, they murdered him. May Allah curse them. Why didn't they ask before giving the fatwa? Why didn't they get knowledge before answering this question? For indeed, this is a hadith of the Prophet ﷺ, the cure to ignorance is asking questions. This is a hadith. The cure to ignorance is asking questions. Once again, we see in this hadith some of the potential dangers of an innocent, perhaps even a naive understanding of the faith that doesn't match up with reality. And the problem comes in our times. All too often, we have genuinely sincere people. Nobody's going to doubt the sincerity of Junayd. His whole life is dedicated to the hermitage, to the monk. Nobody's doubting his sincerity. But he didn't have what is called fiqh, which is understanding. Nobody's doubting the companion who said, oh, you got to do ghusl. There's no... He thinks he knows. And he's intransigent. There is this dogmatism. You have to do this. There's no way forward. But in that dogmatism or in that naive innocence, you literally end up hurting or killing people. You end up disobeying your mother, thinking you're obeying God. When, as the Prophet himself said, may Allah have mercy on this person. If he had knowledge, he would know. He should have quickly finished the salah, make the salah quickly, and go answer his mother. He literally thought prolonging the salah is going to be more pleasing to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Now, the opposite, the end spectrum, or the exact opposite side of the spectrum, is the dangers of reinterpretation or outright rejection, which is also a huge problem. And again, so many instances can be said of this. And the people who embody this the most in the prophetic era are those, the munafiqun, known as the hypocrites. And again, there are many narrations in this regard. One simple narration comes to mind where the Prophet was sitting with a group of people, they were all eating, and there was one of the leaders of the hypocrites, one of the arrogant people there. And he was eating with his left hand, So the Prophet said, oh so-and-so, kul bi yaminik, eat with your right hand. Now eating with the right hand is a sunnah, right? It's a sunnah, you should do it. Unless you're sick or whatever, you should do it. The man became irritated that how dare you tell me which hand to eat with. Now, to become irritated at Rasulullah is not a trivial matter. To become irritated that the Prophet is telling you to do something, and to reject that is not a trivial matter. And so in his anger, he said, La astati', I cannot eat with my right hand. Out of arrogance, the narrator says, this was sheer arrogance. And the one thing that Allah despises the most is arrogance, as we know. As the Prophet said, nobody with an atom's weight of arrogance will enter Jannah. The one thing that he despises the most is arrogance. So the man said, I can't do it. La astati'. So the Prophet gave him his own verdict, and he said, Idan lastata'ta. Okay, in that case, you shall not. You said you cannot? Okay, you shall not. And right then and there, his right hand became permanently paralyzed until he died. He could not lift it up a finger afterwards. This is arrogance. You don't show arrogance to Allah and His Messenger. It's not a joke. When Allah says, do something, and you say, I'm not going to, and you show that. It's one thing you don't do, say, Allah forgive me. That's not arrogance, that's a sin. We're all sinners. That's not arrogance, that's a sin. It's another thing to say, I don't care what you say, I'm not going to do it, which is the paradigm of this hypocrite. And so the response was, as you have seen. Now the problem comes, brothers and sisters, we are kind of sort of navigating that internal, that middle line, where we don't want to be this dogmatic, completely intransigent, not understanding the goals of the Sharia, and at the same time we don't want to reject the Sharia either, right? And these problems and these tensions, frankly, I would say, are one of the greatest crises that religious Muslims and even the not-so-religious Muslims are facing. Because religious Muslims are grappling with how much can we inherit from our tradition and what are we allowed to change from the tradition. Those that are not so religious, a lot of times are turned off, they're turned away. by what they think is religion, and yet it is not necessarily religion. It is a man's interpretation of religion. It is a manifestation of a human interpretation. So we are truly battling between all of these different fronts here. And one simple lecture is not going to solve this problem. But I hope that inshallah ta'ala today's lecture will simply allow us to begin the awkward conversation and allow us to start contemplating from perhaps a paradigm of more empathy and tolerance and knowledge. And I'm going to summarize my lecture in, if we're able to do this, I have how many, 10 points written down. So let's see if I can do 10 points. And inshallah, I'll try to do this as quickly as possible and open the floor for Q&A, inshallah ta'ala. The first point we begin, which is perhaps one of the most important ones. We must differentiate between the law of God and the law of men that they derive from what they think is the law of God. Or to be technical, we separate Sharia from fiqh. Sharia is Allah's revelation. Allah revealed the Sharia. Allah revealed the Sharia means the way, the path. It is the path to Jannah. Now, the Sharia is basically the book, the Quran, and the teachings of the Prophet ﷺ. These are the two infallible sources. However, from these sources to extrapolate our voluminous tomes of law known as fiqh, that is a human project. Now, just because it's a human project doesn't mean it's dismissed. It simply means it is the best attempt of the greatest minds of our ummah to extract from the divine sources. But those tomes of law, those encyclopedic works, are not God's revelations. They're not Allah's revelations. We have to be very clear about this. Allah's revelation is encompassed in two sources, and that is the book that He sent and the Prophet upon whom He sent. These two are what is divinely protected. These are our ultimate sources. Everything that happens after that is a great attempt. It is a magnificent effort, but in and of itself, it is not the revelation of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And one of the easiest ways to show this is that from the time of the Sahaba, from the time of the next generation, from the time of the great Imams, there have been a diversity, not only in the laws, but in the epistemology of deriving laws. Not only in fiqh, but in usul al-fiqh. There has been a standard diversity that has crossed geographic regions, time, space, and in our times we think there are 4 madhabs. In reality, once upon a time there were 30, 40, 50 madhabs. In the early Islam, it wasn't just codified to 4. The tabi'un, the tabi'un, those early generations, their diversity of fiqh is far broader than what we now have as the 4 madhabs. And that's within Sunni. Within non-Sunnis, you have the Ja'fari madhab, you have other madhabs as well. There's plenty. Now these madhabs are great attempts. I'm not dismissing them. But do understand we must differentiate between the human attempt and between the divine revelation. And never should we substitute the human attempt for the actual divine revelation. And this shows us the great Imams themselves, Imam Malik, Imam Shafi, Imam Ibraheem, Imam Ahmad ibn Hanbal. Sometimes for the same issue, you will have 4 different opinions in the 4 different schools. This indicates that human extrapolation. The Quran and Sunnah did not reveal compendiums of law. And you cannot extract those compendiums without the human effort, without an epistemology that is itself slightly contested, and without a final result that is even more contested. Now, just because it is contested, once again, it is not meant to be dismissed. But I'm saying we should never substitute the human product at the end for the divine product at the beginning. And we should be broad-minded and tolerant enough to understand that just because a great scholar in 7th century Baghdad said something, it doesn't mean it is definitively final. Were there other scholars that disagreed? Were there other geographic regions that had other opinions? So the researchers should research beyond just one particular strand, especially when it comes to modernity. The second point, there has always been, from the very beginning of time, a slight tension between extreme literalism and between rationalization of the laws. There has always been a slight tension, sometimes a marked tension, between extreme literalism and between rationalization. And we see this slight tension even in the lifetime of the Prophet ﷺ himself. Many examples can be given. Perhaps the most obvious example is that famous incident of the Banu Qurayza. The Banu Qurayza incident. It's an authentic reported Bukhari Muslim, and it's well known from the Seerah that after the Battle of Khaybar, when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala sent the miraculous winds to get rid of the 10,000 troops that had gathered outside, and the Prophet and the Sahaba came back home to finally relax after 1 month of being on the border, 1 month of being on edge, 1 month of just sacrifice. They came home, they took off their armor, and they're finally just taking a break that needs to be taken. Jibreel comes down, as the report says, and he says to the Prophet ﷺ, if you have taken your armor off, realize the angels have not taken their armor off. Why? Because you haven't dealt with the traitors on the inside. The Banu Qurayza, famous incident, the Banu Qurayza, while they were on the inside, they were one of the Bani Israel tribes. They were supposed to be on the side of Islam. They made a secret alliance with the Quraysh. They said, on such a time, on such a day, we'll open up the door, we'll let you in, you can attack from behind and attack from the front, and we'll be over with. So they were traitors of the highest magnitude. This is treason during war. And they literally collaborated with the enemy. So the Prophet came home, took off his armor. Jibreel said, hey, if you have taken your armor off, we have not taken our armor off. We're going to go straight to Banu Qurayza. Allah has commanded you have to deal with them. Now, the Prophet came back after Fajr, and Jibreel came and told him after Fajr. Salat al-Dhuhr comes, and the people have come to pray Dhuhr. So the Prophet makes the announcement that I have been commanded to go to Banu Qurayza. So, none of you should pray Asr until we get to the Banu Qurayza. This is the command. لا يصلين أحدكم العصر إلا في بني قريظة. None of you should pray Asr till we get to the Banu Qurayza. The Banu Qurayza is like a 2.5 hour walk. So if they leave an hour after Dhuhr, they should get there to enough time to pray Asr, and then Maghrib will come. But it's been a month in the battlefield. People have just come home. They haven't seen their wives and kids for a month. They're tired. Some of them are wounded. So by the time the news spread, and by the time they wore their armor up again, it was basically already Asr in Medina. The Prophet had already gone there. He said, I'm waiting for you. He said, do not pray Asr except in Banu Qurayza. I'm waiting for you there. He had already worn his armor. He's already now, he needs to go. The rest of the companions, they took their sweet time. For legit, we understand. They left after Asr, not after Dhuhr. And by the time they're walking there, Maghrib is now about to come. There is no way they're going to reach Banu Qurayza before sun sets. But they haven't prayed. Are you guys following? What have they not prayed? Asr, right? Now, what's the dilemma here? What's the dilemma? Should we just continue walking and watch the sun set and not pray Asr out of obedience to the literal commandment? Do not pray Asr except at Banu Qurayza. Or should we understand that the meaning was, what was the meaning? Guys, help me out. Reach us as soon as possible, right? The way that it was expressed, is it meant to be literal, or is it meant to be, hey, try your best to get there, and if you can't get there, well then, obviously you're going to pray Asr and then get there. So the Sahaba began debating the meaning of this hadith. Realize the Prophet is alive, he's 3 miles away, but he's not right there, he's not with them. So they began debating. And guess what? They could not reach a unanimous verdict. So half of them stopped and prayed Asr. And the other half continued onwards. And both of them came to the Prophet and explained what happened on the way. And guess what? He did not get irritated at either one. They both tried what they thought was the best. They both had different epistemologies. Their goal was to honor the Sunnah, and they ended up disagreeing. You can want to honor the Sunnah and still end up disagreeing. It is possible to do so. Neither of them were rebuked. Neither of them were told, A'udhu Billah or Munkari Hadith or nothing. One understood that this was literal and they acted upon it. The other understood there's a reason behind it. In this case, the reason is not being met. I need to bring my Asr. And that type of tension between literalism and between rationalization, it is found throughout all of the opinions that the Madhab disagree with. So many times we'll find this type of issue. Therefore, we need to understand this point as well when we look at trying to apply fiqh in modern times. That you will find some people, they're trying to rationalize. Nothing wrong with that per se. And some people are wanting to be literal. That is also coming from a paradigm of innocence and of wanting to follow the Sunnah. A third point that we can bring is that it is a part of the Sunnah to take context into account, take external factors into account. And you don't just derive laws from an ancient book written 1,000 years ago. You do look at reality around you. And it is a part of fiqh and usul al-fiqh to understand reality before you give a particular verdict. And we find this even in the time of the Prophet ﷺ. Now, in classical Islam, the hadith is very clear that we can talk to this in Q&A. I'm not endorsing this in our times. I'm simply saying this is what classical Islam teaches, that those that are traitors and those that are enemies within the faith, they are supposed to be executed. This is the standard law of Islam. And so, actually, the standard law across the globe to this day almost. That if you're a traitor to your community, then you have to leave or do something. Look at Edward Snowden, for example. What's he doing? So there is these laws. If you're a traitor, you're not going to be amongst us. So that was the law. Now, the head of the Munafiqun, Abdullah ibn Ubay ibn Salul, had caused so much irritation and nuisance, softly rebuking the Prophet, causing mass chaos. Umar ibn Khattab, after a particular incident where he just really crossed the line, Ibn Salul, he came to Rasulullah and said, Ya Rasulullah, why don't you execute Ibn Salul? Why don't you just get rid of this person? If we were to apply literalism in this case, he does deserve it, no question. His whole life he was not executed, and he died a natural death. Why? The Prophet said, no, I don't want others to say that Muhammad kills his own followers. Now let that sink in. The Muslims knew Ibn Salul is a traitor. But do you think the Quraysh would care about this distinction? The PR scandal that would happen if he executed Ibn Salul. By the way, who is Ibn Salul? Ibn Salul was the senior most leader in the city of Medina before the migration of the Prophet. He was a respected politician, right? Well known in Arabia. The only person who contended with the Prophet politically was Ibn Salul, because he was the only elder statesman alive. If you remember your Sirah history, there was a civil war in Medina before the coming of the Prophet. That civil war decimated all of the senior noblemen and the politicians except for Ibn Salul. Ibn Salul was the only one who was remaining from that batch. And when the Prophet came, he felt his time had been taken away. His eyes were on the prize. The Prophet came, and who's Ibn Salul now? Nobody. So he became the leader of the hypocrites. Okay. The Prophet understood, if I were to execute this man, the PR that would come from outside of Arabia would damage the entire community. So it is better for the community to deal with him internally than to worry about the PR externally. What are people going to make of this? Oh, he kills his own followers. You had better not convert. You better not go to Medina. You better not become Muslim. That scandal would have been so bad, it's actually easier to deal with his nuisance internally. Also, when he captured Makkah, and now Makkah is all his. The Sahaba in Makkah are just new converts. Muawiyah, Abu Sufyan, he's just new convert, right? The leaders of the Quraysh, they're literally an hour old in Islam. And their Islam at that time was shaky. It wasn't firm. The Prophet confided to our mother Aisha. He said, if only for the fact that your people are brand new in Islam, if only for this, I would have actually destroyed this structure of the Kaaba and rebuilt the original structure of Ibrahim on the foundations of Ibrahim. You all know, if you've been to Makkah, there's that semicircle that Egypt they call it, right? There's that semicircle. When Ibrahim built the Kaaba, it was actually a rectangle, not a square. When Ibrahim built the Kaaba, it was a rectangle, not a square. When the Quraysh rebuilt it in the childhood of the Prophet was 25 years old, the famous incident where he lifted the Hajar Aswad himself, remember that story, right? When they rebuilt it, they ran out of funds. No funds to build a masjid. So they built it as a square with the intention that when they get the funds, they'll build it as a rectangle. Those funds never came. The rest, as they say, is history, is still a square, right? And so the Prophet remembered for 4,000 years, obviously, and while he was a child and a teenager, when he was a child and teenager, this Kaaba was a rectangle. So he says to Aisha radiallahu anha, just because your people are brand new Muslims, I know if I were to do this, they would make this into a huge matter. He destroyed the Kaaba, he did this and that. So in order to placate them, in order to let it be, I'm going to leave it as it is. Once again, there's a sense of taking into account that reality. And point number 4, straight off of point number 3, that difficult times do call for difficult reinterpretations. This is well known. Extenuating circumstances allow for extenuating reinterpretations. And the classic example for this is Umar ibn al-Khattab radiallahu anhu. Multiple times in his caliphate, he quite literally, it seems, modified or adopted or reinterpreted what others might think were clear-cut rulings. But he understood that, hey, things have changed and I need to just fine-tune for the sake of the ummah. Many examples can be given. There are actually dissertations written on this, but one simple example comes to mind that during the 18th year of the Hijrah, 18 Hijrah, there was a massive drought and famine, and people were dying of starvation. And when you're dying of starvation, you do crazy things. So people started breaking into houses and stealing food and whatnot, right? Now, technically, if you're an undergraduate freshman and you study a basic book of fiqh, right? So the penalty of the one who breaks into a house and steals above a certain amount is the cutting off of the hand. This is level 1 fiqh. There is no room for it. The Quran is very clear in this regard. Okay. Umar ibn al-Khattab understood context does matter. There is no Quran or Hadith that says, in time of doubt, suspend this. But Umar al-Khattab understood, he goes, no, now we can't apply this. When somebody steals out of hunger, he's wanting to feed his family, I can't cut his hand off. And so he suspended the Quranic ruling for that entire year because there's an element of extenuating circumstance here. Once again, we find a type of forward-thinking pragmatism, not a fundamentalist dogmatism. The book says so. Well, yes, the book does say so, but the book also says that Allah is Rahim. The book also says that don't kill yourself. The book also says so many other things. So you take your context into account. And just because there's a rule doesn't mean there's no exceptions. Doesn't mean there's no extenuating circumstances. And it is the job of the real faqih. Anybody can be Shaykh Google and look up on Google or on your basic fiqh book what the text says. The real faqih understands the text and understands the context. That's what the real job of the lawyer is. If you just open up a book and apply it, you don't need to go to law school, you can just Google it. You can just be a grade 1 student or a level, freshman in college to do that. The real alim understands where the exceptions are and when to apply them. That's where real fiqh is demonstrated, not in extreme literalism. And the Sahaba, the greatest of them, were exactly like this. And Umar al-Khattab had many such understandings. For example, jizya. For example, not jizya, the issue of mu'allaf al-qulub, which is basically one of the categories of zakat. So there's 8 categories of zakat. 8 categories. One of them, which is the only one that's allowed for a non-Muslim, otherwise you give zakat to Muslims, one category is allowed for non-Muslims, and that is mu'allaf al-qulub. Mu'allaf al-qulub are leaders and movers and shakers of enemies whom you can basically give money to so that they don't attack you. They can soften their hearts. Okay? So there's a potential enemy, and you're worried about him. Money talks in their vernacular. If you don't have iman and faith, what really moves you is money. So you give money to them and they kind of sort of calm down. If you give somebody $1 million, they will appreciate you and realize, okay. So the Prophet used mu'allaf al-qulub a number of times in his life. The Battle of Hunayn is a classic example. Umar al-Khattab, in his time frame, Islam was powerful. There were no weak Arab tribes that were on the verge of leaving Islam. So he said, we no longer need to give mu'allaf al-qulub. And he stopped giving his entire category. Now, once again, a level 1 student of madrasa would say, A'udhu billah, how dare the Quran says you have to do. But you're rebuking the Khalifa of the time, thinking you know better than Umar al-Khattab. There is a rationalization, there's a contextualization that he understands this particular ruling. We don't really need to apply it anymore. And he simply bypassed it. Also, we move to the next point here, that who gets to decide these exceptions? Who gets to understand where a particular ruling doesn't apply? And is this something that is a rejection of the Sharia? Once again, there are so many examples from the time of the Sahaba. And if you really study your fiqh and you study the evolution of fiqh and you study the lives of the greatest giants, the great Abu Hanifa and Shafi and whatnot, you actually become far more tolerant. And I speak from my own experience that when you begin your studies, you are the most intolerant person in the world. You will follow the one madhab, the one opinion that your first teacher taught you. And you think that is it. This is haqq versus batil. This is truth versus falsehood. You're very Manichaean when you're level 1. When you really research and you explore and you study and you read the rich traditions we have, you temper down and you become far more tolerant. It is a sign of fanaticism. It's a sign of superficial knowledge that you're fanatic. And it is a sign of in-depth knowledge that you are tolerant. So there are so many examples. There's a famous hadith recorded in Bukhari and Muslim actually, that the Prophet ﷺ said, do not start saying Assalamu alaikum to a person of the Ahl Kitab. Don't start saying it. If they say to say wa alaikum, this hadith is in Bukhari and Muslim. One of the narrators of this is Ibn Mas'ud. Now it so happened, the famous Ibn Mas'ud. Ibn Mas'ud is the teacher of the teacher of Abu Hanifa. Abu Hanifa's madhab is basically Ibn Mas'ud's type of usul. So Ibn Mas'ud was traveling between two cities. And during that journey, there's a group of people in caravan that travels with you, become friends, you take time with them. This is going to take weeks and months. There were two priests that were traveling in that caravan between two cities. And in the course of the time, they became very friendly and whatnot. When they got to the city, the priests went to their part of the city, and Ibn Mas'ud went to his part, because in those days, the cities were divided on religion, by the way. In those days, the Christians lived in one quarter, the Jews lived in one quarter, the Muslims in one quarter. So when they parted, Ibn Mas'ud said, Assalamu alaikum. His student Alqamah said, weren't you the one who narrated to us that the Prophet said, don't begin salam to the Ahl Kitab? I mean, I heard this from you, and now you said salam. So he said, yes, that is true. But the tariq, the way that the suhbah al-tariq is basically, the companions of the road also have a right over me. Like I've been with them for the last few weeks. And I can't just go without saying salam to them. The companions of the road of the highway, meaning I've been with them for so long, they have a haqq over me. The Quran itself says, by the way, that one of the haqqs that you give is the sahib al-jam and sahib al-wabn al-sari, the one that is your companion in travel. So Ibn Mas'ud said, hey, but this is an exception. I understand the general rule, I'm going to talk it to you. But there is an exception. There's a human element here that I've been with these people for weeks and weeks and weeks. I can't just let them go without giving them a greeting. So here we find one of the greatest of the Sahaba understand that, hey, there are rules, yes, but sometimes there are exceptions to those rules as well. And he's demonstrating those exceptions in his own life. This leads us to the next point. I forgot which number it's on, but whatever you guys are writing, inshallah, there's some benefit at the end. And that is, we also have to take into account one of the biggest conundrums of our times when it comes to Islamic laws, and that is the idea of the nation state. I've spoken about this quite a lot in many lectures. Many people have written about this issue as well. We have to understand, many of you are far more knowledgeable than me in sociology and history, so I feel awkward telling you some of this stuff. You're probably far more knowledgeable than me. But of course, when it comes to the notion of the nation state, right, we have to understand that it's a very, very recent human construct. To divide the world into nations and to have these borders and to have identities for people within these borders. Understand, this literally, especially in the Muslim lands, is 1 century old, that's it, or in some cases 60, 70 years old. And these borders are, of course, figments of imagination, right? So Benedict Anderson, the famous political scientist, wrote that famous book, Imagined Communities. It's a very nice book if you haven't read it. Imagined communities, that's what a nation state is. They have to imagine there's a commonality between them. They have to invent a shared heritage. In reality, there is nothing that combines the people of a nation state together except an imagined reality, right? If you look at it, me as a second generation Pakistani Muslim, I have a lot more in common with the second generation Somali British than I do with many of my fellow neighbors in America itself, right? I have a lot more in common with a Muslim of another ethnicity born in another land, Denmark, let's say, and his parents are Turkish. I actually have a lot more in common with him than I do with my neighbors in America that are perhaps of a different religious persuasion. What is there in commonality? To the point being that the nation state is an interesting construct. We are born into it and we can't imagine a world without it. You realize that 1,000 years ago, 500 years ago, you are either a member of a religious community or you're a member of a tribe. These were the two main ways you would identify, right? You're a tribe or a religious community. And in Islam, it was a mixture of both. You were always a Muslim and then you were a member of some tribe or some a group of people. So the point being, the nation state, its basic premise is everybody whose mother happened to be within a particular parameter when they were born, right? That's the notion, the definition of generally how you become a citizen is your mother happened to be within that geographic region when you were born, right? It's not really in your control. I happened to be born in America, it's not my control, I was born there. So because I was born in America, I automatically inherit American citizenship. I automatically get it, okay? So this citizenship, according to the nation-state theory, confers upon me rights and privileges that should be in complete equality with everybody else who carries that passport. That's what the nation-state is about. Now, obviously, our Sharia came in a different time, a different place. And they have a very different understanding of social hierarchies. And from the Sharia's perspective, it makes a lot more sense to divide people based upon their faith and their ethics and their values. Those who follow a certain ethics and values are Muslims, because that's what Islam is. And those who disagree with the Ahli Kitab, whether Ahli Dhimma or the Ahli Shaykh, whatever they might be, you put them in a different category. It makes a lot more sense to categorize people based upon their philosophy of life, which you choose, not based upon where your mother gave birth to, which you don't choose. Okay? So the Sharia's understanding of society, while it might be more logical, it is problematic for those that are wed to the nation-state theory. And we see this clash. I don't want to get too controversial in my first lecture in Moms or Pakistan or whatever, especially in the state that we're in. Blasphemy laws, for example. Ridda laws, for example, right? We see this clash right now. Do we really apply laws that were meant to, at a time when society was very different? Can we apply those laws in the modern nation state? Let me give you a realistic example. The Muslim Brotherhood Party, just being factual history, I'm not taking sides and literally narrating through history. When it was running for election after the Arab Spring, they were asked point blank, you want an Islamic Egypt, correct? Yes. Egypt is 10% Coptic Christian. Are you going to apply the laws of the jizya? 10% Copts. They're fully Egyptian. Frankly, they're more Egyptian than the rest, because remember, the Copts were the original Egyptians, right? Islam came, and Egypt was 100% Coptic Christian. Over the course of the next 14 centuries, 90% converted, 10% remained Coptic Christian. So, the Islamic Party was asked, Muslim Brotherhood, you want the Muslim nation state, are you going to apply the jizya? And the guy was like, yeah, I guess we can't apply the jizya, so we're not doing that. Okay, so that means Egyptians have full rights, regardless of their nationality, regardless of their religion? I guess, yeah, but they can't be president if they're Christian. Wait, hold on a second. They can't be president, but they're Egyptian. How can they not? Yeah, but they have to be Muslim. Yeah, but you see, so the Muslim party itself began fighting amongst its own. How do we apply Islamic laws in a nation state when the very premises of Islamic society and nation state are at odds with one another? Now, I am not making an argument here for or against. I'm simply telling you, these are some really difficult problems. So much so that many academics say this particular problem doesn't have a solution, because the epistemologies of these two paradigms are completely at odds with one another. And there's a very famous, author, Islamic academic, who's written The Impossible State. Read it. It's a very interesting book, The Impossible State, in which he goes over this issue of the impossibility of applying some of Islam's laws in the modern nation state, not because Islamic laws are backward. This is a Christian, by the way. His name sounds Arabic. He's an Arab Christian. He's not a religious person. His entire thesis is, believe it or not, I'm being very simplistic, so don't misquote me, I'm being very simplistic, but it is his thesis that the nation state is really a very foolish idea. And Islamic law makes a lot more sense from its paradigm. So the fact that you cannot apply it in a nation state is actually an indication of how foolish the nation state is, not how backward the Sharia is. This is a Christian, so nominally Christian academic, pointing out the impossibility of the Islamic state. That's the title of the book, right? The impossibility of Islamic. You can't have, he said, I'm not necessarily endorsing that, you can't have a fully Islamic nation state, according to him. I do sympathize with that at some level, but anyway. Because I gave you some examples here. You're going to bring in jizya for your fellow citizens, then you're not your fellow citizen. Then you're hierarchy, then you're apartheid, then you're creating a system of complete injustice. Then where's the nation state? There is no nation state if there are people in the nation that are different levels and categories. That's South Africa right there. How's that going to happen? So there are some very, very difficult problems. And we have to rethink through them, given the dynamics of our times. Can we rethink through? Now, let's say, for example, jizya, right? Classic example. The Quran is very clear about jizya. The Hadith is very clear about jizya. I challenge you, which Muslim country in our times is taking jizya? Not one. Not one. So with my utmost love and respect for many of the people who are actively wanting aspects of the Sharia, I don't see them clamoring for this aspect. They're very silent about this. One wonders, why are they picking and choosing here? If they want that 100%, they should also be championing for this. But then you do end up in this infinite conundrum. And by the way, I am a defender of the Sharia, obviously. But how much of the Sharia can you apply in modernity when modernity is based upon constructs that are very imaginary, very human? So you must, whether you like it or not, you must at some level modify. Another ruling is, of course, the very controversial issue of what to do with prisoners of war if they're not ransomed. Do you understand that concept? I'm not going to go there. But if they're not ransomed, nobody purchases them. What happens to those prisoners of war? That institution is completely abolished. The Quran allowed it, it didn't prohibit it. The Sharia allows it. Nobody's clamoring for that anymore. They understand that was a past. No need to replicate it. So we understand then that even those parties and even those clerics that are wanting a version of Islam, they think and they kind of tell themselves they want the full version, but in reality they don't. I'm just being honest here. Even as I sympathize, don't think I sympathize with their sentiments, but I'm just being honest here. They have already demonstrated they're picking and choosing, and they're not actually calling for a full-fledged, revival because they can't. So if they have already tacitly acknowledged, can we then get them to rethink through other things as well? That's going to be the job as well that many of us do. Another point that I can add, I think I'm on point number 7 or something now. Another point I want to add here is that much of our discussion is about Islamic policies at the nation-state level or at the domestic level. We have to realize that very little needs to change at the personal level. So we distinguish between the personal level fiqh and between societal fiqh. When it comes to personal level fiqh, morality and rituals, generally speaking, will never change. What is haram even if society allows it. What is halal even if the government bans it. In the eyes of Allah, it's halal. You shouldn't do it if the government bans it, but still, what is haram is haram. In America, we're allowed to drink, we're allowed to gamble, we're allowed to do everything. The government allows it. Does it make it halal? No. So we distinguish between personal morality and rituals, which are far, far less susceptible to change, versus governmental policies, which really, there is an entire branch of Islam called Siyasatul Sharia, or the branch of Islamic politics. Now, this branch is a bit of an advanced branch, and frankly, most madrasas don't even study it. And if anybody has studied in the madrasa, I can ask you politely, have you even heard of the subject? It's such a difficult subject, and also because it's not practical. I mean, it's like Islamic political science, let's put it that way, Islamic political science. And there were great, Al-Mawardi wrote a book, Al-Ghazali wrote a book about this. There's some ulama who wrote books about this, Ahkam al-Sultaniyya, the rules of governance in Islam. The rules of governance are not the same as your personal rules of fiqh. And sometimes the government, Islamic governments, Islamic khulafa, had to do things that the common people themselves did not appreciate, but it didn't change the fiqh for them. So, one of the fundamental differences that I find is that too many people focus on the macro and ignore the micro. And that is one of the problems, I would say, with utmost politeness and respect, of many Islamic parties. They focus on the macro rather than the micro. Change begins at the micro level. Change begins in the individual. And slowly but surely, society will change. But to try to force change at the macro level, to try to force change upon people that are not willing to take it, that's going to be very, very difficult. And on the flip side, many of those who want to completely reform Islam, they're focused on changing the micro to satisfy what they want, and they ignore the macro, right? So they want certain things to be halal at the micro level. Why did the Sharia forbid this? It should be halal. And they want to change it at the individual level. But the general rule is that individual level fiqh, personal fiqh, is very difficult to change. We're talking about nation-state fiqh, we're talking about laws of Islam, which is actually, there's far more leeway with regards to that, even from the classical sciences. But once again, frankly, most madrasa students only study personal manuals of fiqh. If you look at their textbooks, they study Al-Hidayah or whatever the textbook might be, and this is your personal fiqh.
they don't study siyasat al-sharia. They don't study the books and the authors and the methodologies that talk about how do we apply Islam in the time of the Khulafa, much less in modern times. And this leads me to my next point, gradualism and pragmatism. You cannot apply a law upon a people that don't want it to be applied to. America never fails to not learn this lesson over and over and over again. You can invade, you can bomb, you can install puppet governments. You cannot rule over a people that don't want you. Even if you spend 21 years and $7 trillion, the same people you thought you would invade will take over the country in less than 48 hours. It's going to happen, okay? You cannot control a people who don't want you to control them. Now, this also applies to us, by the way. Look at the Arab Spring. It also applies to us. We have to be pragmatic here. You cannot live in some utopic, la-la land of romantic idealism when your own people would not be willing to embrace a type of Islam that you think is the Sharia. It's actually typically not even the Sharia, but you think it is. When your own people are not willing to accept it, you're not going to be able to rule them. So then what else is the alternative? Gradualism and pragmatism. Our mother Aisha has a famous remark in Sahih Bukhari. She says, the first revelations that came down in the Quran, they were about faith in Allah and heaven and hell. And faith grew in their hearts. Then, when faith had become strong, Allah said, don't drink and don't gamble. So the Sahaba said, we're not going to drink, we're not going to gamble. Our mother Aisha continued, she said, if Allah had begun the revelation by saying, don't drink, the Sahaba would have said, Wallahi, we can never give up drinking. This is our mother Aisha talking about the best of generations. Do we think our generation is going to be better than them? Do we think we can begin with the end result rather than the beginning? You have to begin from the beginning. You have to increase that level of faith, that maturity. And all you need to do again is look around you when certain regimes or governments or whatnot that think they are fully Islamic, they bring a level of practice. And let me be brutally honest here, that even their own children and cousins and relatives cannot practice. They bring a version to society that their own extended family does not do. What is going to happen except the collapse of such a government? You cannot begin an Islamic state by banning music, which is itself a contested area. And even if you think it's haram, what percentage of your own family listen to it, your own cousins, your own, even if you, mashallah, if you're able to get to that level, and frankly, how many of them even able to do that? But suppose you do. Your own relatives are not able to follow your commandments. Do you think you're going to begin an Islamic society with this commandment? Why don't we start with eliminating poverty, with making sure nobody's hungry? Before you implement the law of theft and stealing, make sure there's a society that nobody needs to steal to live. So when you have your priorities wrong, right, and you begin with the net result, rather than gradually working your way there, and again, this is where the study of the seerah is so important. In Mecca, what were the revelations? There was not even salah 5 times a day in early Mecca. There was no zakah, there was no fasting. None of the laws of Islam. It was all about iman in Allah, believe in Allah. Allah is Rahim, Allah is Ghafoor, Allah is Wadud. All the names of Allah come down. Heaven and hell comes down. Life and death, the meaning of life and death, the purpose of being here. You install and instill iman in the hearts of the people. Then, when time comes and you have an Islamic society of Medina, gradually, bit by bit, Allah begins to reveal one thing, one thing, one thing, one thing. 7, 8, 9 years come until finally the last revelation of Surah Ma'idah comes, in Hajjatul Wada comes down. 10 years, that's the gradualism. Now, I am not saying we need to replicate that fully, because obviously we have to pray 5 times a day. I'm not going to say we go back to the Meccan era, I'm not saying, but I'm saying the philosophy of applying the Sharia. There's got to be an element that we take from the seerah. We cannot begin from the ending and ignore the entire 20 years that led up to there. You have to have a group of people that are able to comprehend Allah wants us to live ethical lives. When the majority of the Muslim Ummah, let's be honest here, is not even able to wake up for Fajr, do you think they're going to follow your very difficult laws that might even be valid? By the way, many of them are not, they're contested. But even if they are, where do you begin? So there's an element of gradualism, there's an element of pragmatism that the Sharia itself requires you to do. And I also say here that perhaps this level of harshness that we find in some of the people with these visions, it's perhaps an overcompensation, frankly, for their own deficiencies or the deficiencies of the world around them. There's a psychological complex. I need to be stricter here to overcompensate for my not able to do it elsewhere. But the point being that something is better than nothing. And if we can apply 10-20% of the Sharia properly, it is better than attempting to apply 90% knowing we're going to be rejected. And the seerah teaches us this. We begin gradually, bit by bit. We push the boundaries from within. We don't start from the very ending. And this leads me to my next point, and that is that there are different groups of people out there, all of them wanting to benefit, the religion of Islam. They have the best interests of the ummah at mind, and yet for some weird reason, they take each other as the worst enemies, and they ignore far bigger threats outside. And it is high time that we actively begin preaching against this internal hatred and sectarianism. Anybody who loves the religion and wants to come closer to Allah, to God, to the Prophet ﷺ, the Sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ, anybody, you should look at the good before you disagree with them. And I'm not saying they're all the same, but what we find here is a level of religious intolerance and fanaticism that is truly depressing, to be honest. And it goes against the spirit of our religion completely. If somebody disagrees with your interpretation of the religion but wants to be religious, surely you understand that that is better than somebody who does not want to be religious. So look at the companions. They disagreed about the praying of Salat al-Dhuhr, Asr, to pray to not to pray. That didn't lead them to say, you're rejecting the hadith, you're munkar this, you're that. They understood that their niyyah was good. They understood we're on the same page even if we get to different conclusions. You're not my enemy when you reach a different conclusion, because I know you want to please your Lord. That should be the premise. We have far bigger problems of modernity, of post-colonization, of globalization. We have physical threats from entities that want to harm our societies. And unfortunately, the religious folks, and they are a minority anyway, what percentage of people actually are interested in the deen and the science of the deen? The religious folks, you find them to be the most antagonistic towards each other. And the non-religious folks are in complete bewilderment. What do you mean you guys don't pray behind each other, but you're both praying to the same God, facing the same qibla, bowing the same number of times, and you're calling each other kafir? I don't even pray. I don't even pray, and I think you're both Muslim. Sometimes that innocent, irreligious Muslim is more correct in his assessment than the two strongly religious Muslims who can't see eye to eye. So we really have to understand that sectarianism, frankly, is one of the biggest turn-offs for the non-religious folks. And I'm being honest here, and I think many of you agree with this. One of the biggest reasons that, and there are many good people, wallahi, this country there's a lot of good in it. I visited many times. I'm from here ethnically, but I've never lived amongst you. But mashallah, alhamdulillah, our qawm, mashallah, maybe a little bit proud here. In America, mashallah, the majority of masajid, we are the ones that are building them, financing them, and being in charge of them. Even though statistically we're 30-40%. But in terms of our religious zeal, alhamdulillah, it has its negatives, but it has its positives as well, alhamdulillah. But it really hurts to see so much sectarianism, what do you call it, firqabazi, so much antagonism that people, for the most trivial reasons, cannot pray behind one another, considering the other to be a heretic, considering kafir and whatnot, even though they're all on the same side. If they only studied from the time of the Sahaba, there were differences. The great Imams were different from one another. Tolerance. Just be pragmatic and understand. You can love Allah and love the Messenger and still come to a different conclusion. That person might be wrong. He's not your enemy. You might disagree, but disagree with etiquette and manners. So this is an important point as well, that we have far bigger fish to fry, as we say. And anybody who wants to come close to our Lord, we cut him some slack. We give him the element of what is called husn al-dhann. We think the best thoughts of that person. And we don't make this person to be an enemy, even if we disagree. I'm not saying they're all right, but I'm saying disagree with some etiquettes and manners. And this leads me to my final point, which is that, of course, this does not mean that anybody who says anything about the religion we should ignore. We understand that there are some people who really don't care what the religion says. And they want to justify their lifestyles and their sins by saying things about the religion that are false. There are two camps, as we said. You have the ultra-liberal reformers, you have the ultra-fanatic conservatives. Okay? Both of these camps are not the middle way. Both of them have their faults. We need to be cautious of both of them. The one might be innocently naive, but they will literally end up killing people. Think about what I just said, and you all know examples, even though I'm referring to the hadith, but you know examples in our times as well. Their innocent fanaticism will end up killing people thinking they're doing something for the name of God, in the name of God. That's very dangerous. Very dangerous. On the flip side, you have people who just don't care what Allah has said. They don't care what the Sharia has come down with. And if they speak of the religion, it is in a mocking tone. It is like that hypocrite who mocked the Prophet ﷺ. And what good will that do? That is a sign of arrogance. By the way, both of these feed off of each other. Both of these feed off of each other. They justify their existence by quoting and using the other to make sure they validate their own paradigm. This is an interesting, sociological reality as well, if you think about it. Each one makes the other to be the middle, even though they're both fringe movements. The middle majority of Muslims, deep down inside, they know Islam is true. They want to be good. They want to be righteous. But they're turned off by both of these sides. So it's time that that middle majority reclaims its majority status. And it needs to do so by navigating this difficult field and understanding, as I said, many of these points, and understanding that it is possible to rethink through aspects of our tradition while still loving our tradition, maintaining our tradition, and understanding we wouldn't be here without our tradition. We don't have to reject tradition, but it is allowed to fine-tune and rethink and still be a faithful Muslim who believes in Allah and His Messenger. I hope that inshallah there was some benefit in my meandering thoughts. This was a bit of a last-minute talk that I prepared. I hope inshallah there's some benefit, and I can open the floor for Q&A inshallah. How do you take it? Just raise your hands, or how do you typically do that? Just want to raise your hands? Do that? It's up to you. You're the... You can... Oh, you want me to select? Okay. Okay. Bismillah. Whoever, go Bismillah. Okay. Wife's down.
Expand understanding of this. So, as a Muslim who knows the religion that he follows, it is from the one true creator of the heavens and the earth, right? And he knows that. So, it's just a belief that one hasn't internalized. As a Muslim, you submit that you recognize that that's the one true God of the heavens and the earth. So, isn't it logical or intuitive for that person to know that everyone's struggle, at least someone who claims to be Muslim, this struggle should be ideological and practical to implement the Sharia 100% to the best of their capacity in the environment, in the society. Because that's the basic question I have, because I think you would agree that Islam isn't exactly a buffet where we can choose what suits us and we can bring about things that might be inconvenient. So how exactly should we draw the line, and wouldn't it be hypocritical of us to do exactly that? To pick and choose things that...
Excellent. So I have not said that Islam is a buffet and we just pick and choose. That's not the point of my talk. What I was saying was that there is, or there have always been, a multiple series of interpretations. You have, from the very beginning of time, a sincere attempt to arrive at the truth with a capital T. And yet, when these scholars arrive, they discover that their truths are different from each other. So it should at least give us a sense of humility that when you arrive at what you think is the truth, understand that is your version of the truth. And if other scholars have reached other versions or other interpretations, there should be a level of tolerance here. This is why I think one of the points I might have wanted to add, I guess, we should look at the institution of unanimous consensus, ijma'. I think ijma', if you know what Sunni fiqh, usul al-fiqh is a good indication of a red line, that you don't go beyond this. When you find that everybody of the tradition has agreed to a particular ruling, for example, there are 5 prayers a day. There is unanimous consensus, there are 5 prayers a day. Somebody comes along and says, let's make it 4, let's make it 6. There is no room for this, okay? But where there have been a diversity of voices, and you wish to choose your own, even if you choose your own, at least concede the possibility that the others might be right. Imam al-Shafi'i, and he is who he is, famously remarked, I believe my opinion is right, but I concede the possibility it can be wrong. And I believe the opinion of my opponent is wrong, but I concede the possibility it can be right. So especially in matters where, from the beginning of time, there have been a multiplicity of voices, in my opinion, it is unwise for the state to adopt a voice and make it the only opinion, in my opinion. From the beginning, if ulama have differed, then why should the state choose a personal issue and make it the default? It doesn't make sense to me. And that's why in the time of the Abbas al-Khulafa, Imam Malik ibn Anas, the greatest scholar of the time, was invited by the Khalifa. And the Khalifa said, I would like to make your school the official school of Islam. And this is what you show a real scholar. Any one of us, if I had been invited by the Khalifa, your opinion, Yasir Qadhi, will be the Ummah. Mashallah, I'll be the first to sign. That's the sign of a real scholar. You know what Imam Malik said? Don't do that. Don't ever do that. Because how do I know everything? What if something was lost from me? What if a companion said something about the Prophet and I don't know it? He went to another land. I only know Medina. I've lived in Medina. How about Ibn Mas'ud was in Iraq and whatever? So don't do this. And let the people differ as they're differing. You know, if Imam Malik had an ego, alhamdulillah he didn't. If he had an ego, all of us would be Maliki right now. There would be no other madhab. That's the power of the state. Imam Malik understood the state should not get involved in interpersonal fiqh issues. There should be a diversity. So I hope you understand, I'm not calling for a pick your own, choose your own menu. But I'm saying there should be a humility on, now look, the average Muslim who has never studied Islam, you have no option but to do taqleed. Like, I'm not a medical doctor, okay? May Allah protect me. If I ever fall sick, I go to the doctor, I'm not in a position to challenge what the doctor says. The max I can do is to look at his credentials. He's a proper MD, he has a track record of good history, whatnot. If I want to get a second or third opinion, then I'll compare the credentials of the doctor. I will not compare the opinion. My life is at stake. If my life, may Allah protect me, to give a hypothetical example. If my life is at stake, I'm not going to choose the opinion that is the least costly. I'm going to really think and choose based upon the credentials of the doctor, even if one opinion is more difficult or more easy. The veracity of opinion is independent of how easy it is or how difficult it is. Sometimes the easier opinion is actually the correct one, and sometimes the difficult opinion is the correct one. This is another misconception that many innocent Muslims have. Just like Jurayj, my salah or my mother? No, I'm going to follow the salah. Sometimes the easier opinion is what Allah wants you to do. So ease and difficulty in and of itself is not a primary factor. It is a secondary, tertiary. It's not a primary factor. Therefore, I'm not calling for an open buffet. But I'm saying, once you have chosen your menu, concede the right of another scholar, a qualified person, to choose a slightly different menu, and don't impugn his integrity or his sincerity. That was my point here. Okay, inshallah. I guess go from here.
So, I have a question regarding Islamic State and the system of government that we have referred to. So, overall, we have two major interpretations. One is from ulama like Maududi and Dr. Israel, who say that this system needs to be implemented coming from certain interpretation from Quran, in which God Almighty refers to this. But on the other hand, we have ulama like Amir Sinai, Javed Ahmed Ghamidi, and Maulana Wahiduddin and others, who say that self-purification and self-meditation, self-improvement is more important than establishment of Islamic State and Islamic government in that sense, which is some sort of expansionist. So, what is your take on this? Because this leads us to a dilemma. Because if we go with that expansionist approach, we see there are a lot of problems with that develop already. The establishment of an Islamic government, Islamic State. But on the other hand, if we go with the other interpretation and consider it has a lot of problem in it as well. So, what is your simple take on this?
Very good question. I have actually given multiple lectures about this. Interestingly enough, the very last video on my YouTube channel was an interview that was done in Turkey by Islamic organization, and I just uploaded it to my YouTube channel. If you log into my YouTube channel, youtube.com/Yasir Qadhi, the very latest lecture is a Q&A about this topic. So there'll be a lot of information there, but I will answer you in that I firmly believe both of these interpretations have legitimacy and good people, and I don't doubt their sincerities, and I know they wanted to help Islam. I still find my own life and teachings and methodology more in line with beginning at the grassroots level. And if you look at my lectures, you see this. And the reason for this is actually, frankly, pragmatism. i.e., if I were to clamor for an Islamic state in America, it's only a matter of time before they send me to Guantanamo. And what have I accomplished? And what has happened? And what is going to happen? Whereas if I begin by preaching and teaching my children, my neighbors, my community, be better Muslims, be ethical, follow the process and be honest, be role models, preach Islam through your actions more than your speech, then what happens? More and more people are influenced, which alhamdulillah I've seen in my own life. Alhamdulillah, may Allah keep us all sincere and on the straight path. I have seen this in my own life, that when you concentrate on the individual, there are tangible benefits that happen. And people genuinely change. And they act as catalysts for other people to change. Let's be, again, brutally honest, the Arab Spring. Again, I'm not taking sides, I'm simply narrating history. The Muslim Brotherhood, founded in 1936 by Hassan al-Banna, overall, they have done a lot of good work. 75 years they are wanting to get the kursi. They finally get it. And within a year and a half, the people themselves turn against. And the hidden governments and the deep states and the military, whatever, does what it does. And once again, they go back to square one. I'm not going to say what have they accomplished, because they can say public awareness. But I will say, imagine if those 75 years were spent to make the people ethically, spiritually at a higher wavelength. Would a corrupt regime have been able to rule over such a pure people? So there's two ways of looking at it, and I really respect both sides. And I'm not going to criticize any side. But I find myself just being on the more pragmatic side, that I have one life to live. Allah knows how many more years I have left. I want to accomplish as much tangible good as I can. And I find that starting at the individual level is where change can actually occur. Allahu A'lam. Okay, yes, sister, go ahead.
Assalamu alaikum,
Oh,
Shaykh.
brother, okay, yes.
How are you?
Alhamdulillah.
Okay, it was very nice to see you live. My question, actually I have two questions, right? So I'll list both of them and then you can reply accordingly. One is that you touched about, like Sharia is a spectrum and there is diversity of opinions that we agree with. And you touched on one side that don't be fanatic, right? But on the other hand, some people are on the other end of the spectrum who try to, like, let me give you examples. So say that LGBT is also like okay and Muslims should support it. Item number, songs in movies is also okay. All some of these things are okay, right? And they're also open for interpretations. Okay, so you barely touch those elements. I've seen often, people barely touch, although they have a lot of loud voice, even in Pakistan and abroad. So a lot of people are, in my opinion, in my humble opinion, are not addressing that core issue as well. So you're only addressing the issue about religious fanaticism and organizations, but a lot of that issue is not touched. The second question is that, as you said, that fiqh requires an understanding of the environment, with the fiqh al-waqi'. A lot of problem is coming from YouTube, where you have one opinion coming from someone sitting in the West, then someone sitting in Saudi Arabia having two conflicting opinions. So, for instance, I saw one of your videos in which you said that shaking hand can be sometimes allowed. It's on YouTube, right? A lot of people will misunderstand and they'll say, hey, I'm going to go to Lums and the girls are over there and they're just friends and they shake hand because so and so person said so. I would like your clarification on both these issues. Jazakallah khair.
Okay, so the first issue that in this lecture, I didn't address the other side as much. You're absolutely right, I didn't. Time is limited. And I made a judgment call. Maybe I was wrong, maybe I was right. I assume that most of the people who would come would already know a little bit about me, hence already be listening to religious lectures anyway. So they needed that side more, right? I can assure you, when I speak to academic audiences and to the other side, I emphasize them more. So I cater to my audience, and I made a judgment call assuming that the people that would come today would generally be on the more religious side. But I have plenty of times criticized quite harshly. And in fact, I even have a lecture online done almost 12, 13 years ago called Making Progress with the Progressives. Listen to that one, where I really took them to task. And I have much less respect for that branch than I do for the fundamentalists. At least the fundamentalists love Allah and His Messenger. You can give them that much, even though sometimes they cause a lot of mayhem and chaos. But at least they have something. Whereas the exact opposite side, frankly, there's arrogance. And the two are not the same. They are not the same level of evil. Arrogance and innocent zeal, they are not the same thing. So I have little respect for those that don't care about the Sharia. But at the same time, one of our problems is that our brothers that are very religious and conservative don't understand the difference between forward-thinking traditionalism and between liberalism. There's a huge difference, literally world of a difference, between those that are calling for rethinking through the books of fiqh versus those that are calling for rethinking through Allah's Sharia. There's a huge difference. And you need to have ilm to know the difference between the two. Or else, it sounds all the same to you. And I'm not trying to put you on the spot, but frankly, the two examples you gave illustrate this. LGBT or music. How can you possibly, I'm not trying to put you on the spot, how can you possibly compare LGBT justification with music? Ibn Hazm was a musician. There are books, our ulama, I personally don't like I'm not going to use the word term, just don't like it overall. But we have to acknowledge that there has been, from the beginning of time, legitimate ikhtilaf. Whether you like it or not, it's a historical fact. There are scholars who played musical instruments. And they justified it from the Islam that music is haram only if it is linked with fahisha, with vulgarity. Otherwise, in its essence, now this is a minority opinion, I agree, but is it an opinion or not? Now, LGBT, has anybody ever justified Islamic history? Never. Also, even if you were to follow the majority opinion that music is haram, we have to be teaching our audiences that the word haram does not mean it incurs the same level of sin. The word haram basically means there is some sin involved. You can have the lowest level of haram, and you can have murder and rape and shirk, which is the highest level, and you'll still use the word haram. So one of our problems is that the folks that are not that religious, and they don't understand the technical terms, you say to them, murder is haram, yes, yes, okay. Rape is haram, yes, yes, okay. Shirk is haram, yes. Music is haram. Like, what? Hold on a second. You mention music in the same list because they don't understand the technicalities. It's our job as fuqaha, as people who teach them, to explain haram is a huge spectrum. And there are certain things that are haram that will take you to Jahannam. And there are other things that are of the smallest sagha'ir, the smallest of sins. And if you are overall practicing and praying and doing wudu and whatnot, they're going to automatically absolve the sins anyway, even if it is not good to do. But it's not to that level of murder and shirk. So LGBT is of the worst types of filth and haram. And music is a contested area. And even those who said it, they would say, this is like the very first thing in the spectrum of haram. Like the smallest thing you can possibly do. Not even comparable to ghiba, to namima, to buhtan, which is 1,000,000 times worse than music. So we are obsessed with these minutiae and sometimes lump them with the biggest things, and this confuses our audience that is not that religious. So this is my point here, is that if I were catering to one side, is because I'm catering to the audience here. And the second question about YouTube and whatnot, you're absolutely right. This is one of our problems. Our previous brother said about the buffet. So once upon a time, there was only one menu, your local scholar. And in some ways that was good, in some ways that was bad. Today, we have millions of menus. And we don't even know what to do. So what I advise everybody is to find a scholar of your community and your ethnicity and your people. I have always said this. You should find a scholar who is grounded in the tradition and understands modernity and lives with you people. That's your scholarship. because fatwas change from place to place. Famously, Imam al-Shafi'i changed his opinions when he moved, from Yemen to Egypt. He changed his opinions. And Imam Ahmad and others, I have many examples I can give you. Certain issues, because one of the principles of fiqh says, culture is the primary source of law when the law is silent. Al-urfu muhakkam. One of the sources of law is culture. I'll give you a simple example, by the way, so you understand what I'm saying here. Imam Ahmad ibn Hanbal lived in Baghdad in the 3rd century, where there was wealth and civilization. Imam Malik lived in Medina in the early part of the 2nd century, where poverty was still there. So the livelihood was different and whatnot. Imam Malik, there was one living room. Imam Ahmad ibn Hanbal, there were multiple living rooms. Imam Ahmad ibn Hanbal was asked, should a wife sit with the guests when they eat food? He said, why would she do that? She should sit in her own room. Imam Ahmad was told, but Imam Malik said it is okay. In the Muwatta, Imam Malik has a chapter that it is actually okay for the wife to sit with the guests if she is properly covered. So Imam Ahmad said, that must have been Medina of his time, and we are Baghdad of our time. Basically, I'm paraphrasing here. So how strict parda and how strict ikhtilat, what's the word for ikhtilat in Urdu? Ikhtilat kya Urdu? Is there ikhtilat? Huh? Ikhtilat, it's a technical term, intermingling of the genders, right? It's a technical term. How strict parda and intermingling, frankly, there is an area that is culturally sensitive. And then there are the no-go zones, okay? And here we have a classic example between Imam Malik and between Imam Ahmad ibn Hanbal about should we all eat together at the dinner table or not. And in Imam Malik's Medina, which was poverty, less space and whatnot, it was still the norm that everybody sits together at the dinner table. And as long as she's dressed and there's no inappropriate stuff, why not? And Imam Ahmad in Baghdad, wealth is there, whatnot. We see this to this day in many cultures. If the family sits together with the guests, and in many cultures, they have 2 separate living rooms, right? So here we have this issue of al-urfu muhakkam. You're asking me what is to be done? I say, follow local ulama who live with you, who are traditionalist, forward-thinking. I know it's a lot of it, that's what I say. With regards to this quote-unquote controversial fatwa that I have given, I understand it is very problematic for many Muslims to hear this, and it makes people automatically dismiss me, which I understand. But we live in a different world in America. And there are opinions in the Shafi'i school that allowed the shaking of a hand between the genders when there is no shahwa, when there's no lust or whatnot. So many of our scholars have said that given the difficult circumstances of job interviews, of going to this and that, if a person is forced by awkwardness to do this, I didn't say it's jaiz, I said it's makruh, by the way, as long as there's no shahwa. This is the Shafi'i method. So I'm not inventing something out of thin air. And listen, if you don't like the opinion, no problem. Follow the strictest, and I'm not forcing my opinion on you, right? If you really, and it was for the American context, I would never give it in a Muslim context. It doesn't make any sense to me. And I was very clear, this isn't job interviews or the whatnot, so I would not give it in a Muslim context. But
Shaykh, the problem is that YouTube has access to everyone, even if they're living Pakistan.
which is why if you really listen to all my lectures, I always say, do not outsource your fatawas. I always say this. Follow local amongst your own society who are forward-thinking. Anyway, I want some sisters to ask. There was a sister here, and then you're next. Go ahead. Yes, go ahead. Coming from America, I'm very gender, 50-50%. You know what I'm saying? One man will have to do this, or else I get in trouble. And I think that's the way we should always do this. Bismillah, yes.
So my question is also related to state and religion.
Yes.
Now that the concept of nation state is so much integrated in society that everywhere we see a nation state with you. Do you think religion now should be a personal matter, or should state intervene in religion and make it its own matter?
Excellent question. The reality is that, and this is something that if you read some of the greatest minds of anthropology of our times, Talal al-Asad is one example, Saba Mahmoud is another example. These are 2 people you should definitely be reading if you're interested in this question. They demonstrate the fallacy of this notion that the state is somehow a neutral actor. The state can never be a neutral actor, because by definition the state has a position on everything. And you see this from France to America, the First Amendment. You see this across the globe. To what level? So the state is never neutral. It cannot be neutral. The question therefore is, to what level should a Muslim majority country try to influence the state to be in accordance with ideal Islamic laws? That's a totally different question. To put it to you bluntly, should a Muslim majority country allow alcohol to be freely available? Why would any Muslim say yes? No, we should want alcohol to be difficult. We don't want people to just be able to go to the store and buy alcohol, okay? But I live in America, what can I do? Nothing. I can do nothing about that. So then we have to deal with it and tell our children not to drink. But if I were to be in a Muslim majority country, should I not try my best that some reasonable laws are passed, that we want to ban this, we want to do that? I think that's a common sense thing. Because you see, again, this is human psychology. See, evil has always existed. You know, when I say certain things, people are shocked. My dear brothers and sisters, do you really think that nobody drank alcohol in the prophetic Medina? I mean, read your history. There was a Sahabi in the time of the Prophet ﷺ, Sahih Bukhari hadith, Sahabi. He would be brought in front of the Prophet ﷺ for constant drunkenness and constantly whipped. So much so that one of the companions got irritated and said, "May Allah's la'na be on you. Aren't you embarrassed and ashamed? How many times we have to drag you in front of the Prophet ﷺ to punish you?" And guess what our Prophet ﷺ said? He turned to the Sahabi and said, "Don't say, may Allah's la'na be on you. Are you helping shaitan against your brother? Make dua for him, not against him. Wallahi, I know that in his heart, he loves Allah and His Messenger." This is an amazing hadith, by the way. I wish I could comment on it, right? The Prophet ﷺ defended the drunkard against the one who would have been assumed to be the more pious Sahabi. But he didn't defend the drunkenness. He said, "Why are you making matters worse?" So even in prophetic Medina, there were drunkards. Think about that. You cannot have this idealistic utopic dream that some of these groups in the world thought they could have. There is no such thing, because man is weak and man is going to slip. But here's the point. The Sahabi got drunk, he must have gotten it somewhere, made it himself. We don't want him to just walk into the store and purchase it easily. See, we don't want him to do that. And if a sin is discovered, we keep it discreet as much as possible. We don't want to name and shame and bring people and have scandals, he slept with she. Why? Keep it undercover, because when you publicize the sin, you trivialize the sin and you incentivize the sin. So we have a different philosophy about sin. We don't like scandalous tidbits in newspapers, and we don't. The story of Aisha slander is perfect. Allah says in the Quran, when you heard of this, why didn't you turn away and be quiet? Why did you have to spread it? Why did you have to just be quiet? Don't have to spread it. Even if it's true, even though it was a lie, even if it's true, why do you want to be scandalous in this regard? So the question is not, should the state get involved or not, because the state is always involved. Whether it does or it doesn't do, that is an involvement. Even the state not getting involved is an involvement, right? Because that is a position. So the question therefore is, to what level should the state be involved? And the response is, every single country should look at its own situation and figure out what will work best. But I am a firm believer in pragmatic gradualism. I'm a firm believer. You need to start with baby steps. You need to start internally, and you let the preachers preach and teach, and the laws are going to follow behind the level of society. Okay? Not 10 steps ahead. Maybe 1 step ahead, but definitely not 10 steps ahead. Gradualism. Wallahu a'lam. I don't know where the mic is. I really have no charge now. Who has the mic? It has disappeared. What?
Could we have it here? Geographical difference. I can talk without a mic.
I can see you can talk without a mic. Bismillah, go for it. Okay.
That's a short question. There is a perspective that we are responsible for our actions, and we are. The result is Allah's responsibility, so we don't worry about it. And we do the best we understand, and do not evaluate worldly consequences. What's your opinion on this?
That's a very broad statement, that we do what we can, we leave the rest to Allah. That's agreed insofar as what we are doing is within the confines of allowability of the Sharia. If somebody goes beyond what is allowed by unanimous consensus, by the scholarly community, we cannot be quiet on this. We have to speak out and say, no, you cannot do that. So judgment of heaven and hell is always Allah's, no matter what the person does. We never assign heaven and hell to an individual in this dunya. Never. We don't know the end result. But we may assign the actions of this person to be heavenly or to be satanic. The actions, we can say, "Ye jo kaam kar rahe hai, it's wrong. He should not do this." Whether he goes to hell or not, we should be quiet. That's up to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and we never take on the place of Allah. So your premise is valid insofar as what the person is doing is within the purview of what the Sharia allows, or at least there's a scholarly difference of opinion over. But the minute you go beyond that, classic example is these radical groups like ISIS or whatever, okay? We cannot be quiet and say, well, jo kar rahe hain karne do, Allah's gonna judge them. Allah will judge them, but we cannot allow them to exist. We have to stop this level of fanaticism. The same goes on the other side, the complete rejectors and don't want to do anything related to Islam. You cannot do this publicly. You cannot, make fun of Allah and His Messenger in public and think there are no repercussions, for example. So there is a middle ground, and that middle ground is we allow people. So let me give you the best example. I love this example, by the way. The first splinter group that broke away from the Ummah, the first firqa, what was it? Who can tell me? The Khawarij, right? The Khawarij are still around in some lands, very small percentages. The first firqa that broke away. They had a very bizarre belief, very different from mainstream Islam. In the time of Ali radiallahu anh, they were the ones who broke away. So Ali radiallahu anh attempted his best to convince them to come back to what is mainstream Islam. And I love this example because both Sunnis and Shi'as admire Ali radiallahu anh. So this becomes an example that both Sunnis and Shi'as can do, and Sunnis and Shi'as represent 99% of the Ummah. Alhamdulillah. So this is Ali radiallahu anh, his commandment. He sent the best theologian, Ibn Abbas, to negotiate with this Khawarij group and to debate with them. The books of history mention the debate. He managed to convince, some say half, some say 2/3. He managed to convince, and they came back to the camp of Ali. 1/3, that was 2,000 people, remained on their beliefs and ideologies. They did not convert back to Ali radiallahu anhu's a version of Islam. If you're Sunni, you're going to say that was Sunni. If you're Shia, you're going to say that was Shia. Whatever it was, this group camped away from Kufa, and they made a city and civilization away from mainstream Islam, and they practiced a different interpretation of Islam. Now, Ali radiallahu anh was the Khalifa. There was no Islamic state. He was the Islamic state, right? And if he wanted to, he could have said, I'm going to force them to follow my opinion. These are heretics. These are bidati. These are munkari hadith. They were munkari hadith, by the way. The Kharijites did not believe except in the Sunnah. Okay, they didn't accept in the books of hadith, narrations of hadith. They were only like a type of Qur'ani. A type of, I don't want to go into too much technical. They weren't full Qur'anists, but they weren't Sunnis either. That's why they're Kharijites. So these were heretics, and they were definitely heretics. Ali radiallahu anh attempted verbally. When he wasn't able to, what did he say? He famously remarked, we have no right to force you, as long as you don't harm other people. If you live peaceful lives, we have no right to hurt you, to force you. He allowed a non-Sunni or non-Shi'i, whatever you call it, firqa, to remain and thrive. He only got involved when they began massacring ISIS, basically, right? Because ISIS is Kharijite. When they began massacring other Muslims, that's when he got the army involved and he attacked them. This is Islamic pragmatic tolerance. You have no option but to live and let live, even if you disagree. See, here's the difference. I'm not saying all interpretations are valid. I have my interpretation. Ask me any question in fiqh and I'll defend it. In aqeedah and I'll defend it. And I'll say the other position, like Imam al-Shafi'i, has the potential to be wrong. I think my position is right. But there's got to be a pragmatic tolerance and sometimes a genuine respect of tolerance, not just pragmatic. I will be the first to say I don't agree with those who, let's say, don't like the Sahaba. I don't like that. I don't like that attitude. But there's a pragmatic, what am I going to do about it? My anger or my fanaticism is not going to get rid of them. I don't want to physically harm them. So there must be a level of pragmatic tolerance. Let them live. Beyond this, those within the mainstream, four madhabs or whatnot, I shouldn't just be pragmatic tolerant. I should welcome this diversity and say, alhamdulillah, some room for breathing and whatnot is over here. So I hope that answers your question that in this regard, inshallah, okay? Anyway, I have no clue where the mic is, but let's hand it back to a sister. Okay, we have two sisters.
Sir, you said that we need
Which, is that you? Okay, bismillah, okay.
You said that we need to cut some slack and be tolerant, and then you gave the example of the Sahabi doing asr differently. But as far as I know, that is fake. Asr is fake. But what do you have to say about when there is a clash of aqidah? You simply think an action is shirk, and your other person doesn't believe so, like say grave worship or something. How do you deal with that?
Study more and more. I have given an entire lecture on this. Are you aware of the lecture I gave recently about this, huh? There's my longest lecture on YouTube. It's 3 hours long. 3 hours long. It's called On the Najdi Da'wah. Listen to that one, okay? I have given a very detailed lecture about this reality of calling out to the dead. And yes, even if you think it is shirk, even if you think it is shirk, you can oppose it verbally. You can continually try to correct your friend, your colleague, your cousin who's doing this, but you cannot become violent. You cannot. As long as they don't become violent, you have no right to become violent against them. This is the verdict of Ali radiallahu anhu. So even if you feel you cannot live with this person, your cousin, you break off, that's frankly your prerogative. I can't even tell you, that's your prerogative. If you think that his deviancy or her deviancy is so bad, I cannot sit at the same table, fine. That's your social boycotting. But you cannot become from verbal and intellectual to physical. That's where we draw the line. And we say, unless they harm other people, you cannot harm them. This is, we learn it from Ali radiallahu anhu. By the way, even this issue, if you know anything about my trajectory, I was of this opinion once upon a time, that anybody who invokes the dead has committed shirk. But I did my own deep dive and research and whatnot, and to me now I am on the position that it is potentially shirk, but not inherently shirk. And we should assume the best of our fellow Muslims, and we should make an excuse and say it is haram, and it is bid'ah, and it is munkar, and it is wasila ila shirk, but in and of itself it is not shirk for multiple reasons that I've gone into in the lecture. And this is the default position of mainstream Sunni Islam, historically speaking, and by the way of Shia Islam, it is the default position. It is a relatively new position by Ibn Abdul Wahhab that it is always shirk. It is unprecedented in Islamic history. This position has become mainstream in many circles, and I also was of this opinion 10 years ago. But listen to that lecture. It's my longest lecture, and I was forced to give it because of many things that happened to me and whatnot. I gave this last year. So it's called On the Najdi Da'wah. 3 hours long. Take your time, and I will, inshallah, deconstruct in that lecture all of this issue. So I hope by the end of the lecture you will understand that I don't endorse this. And I think, again, I mean, I have my opinions of Islam. I don't think that we should go to the grave of a person and say, hey, can you cure my son? I just don't think we should do that. I think we ask Allah. That's my position. I think the Quran teaches us this. But those Muslims that do that, they're, yes, incorrect, but they're still Muslim. It's very dangerous when we say you're kafir. You understand this? It's very dangerous when we say you are no longer Muslim. You agreed. You are very perceptive, and I actually say this. In the car here, I was talking to you, right? In the car here. I have red lines. I have red lines. Those red lines are anybody who contradicts the basic kalima. So if you worship an entity, a god, Rama, Krishna, Allah, Al-Uzza, you can't be a Muslim. If you worship Buddha, Jesus Christ, you literally intend that to be a god. What our fellow Muslims do at the grave, if you were to go to that person and say, are you worshipping the Pir? He himself will, what? Ibadat? Nahin, ibadat to nahin kar raha hu. Tawassul, wasi, jo bhi, whatever interpretation they have, they don't intend worship. Do you understand this point? Whereas when you go to the Hindu or the Christian, are you invoking Jesus? Of course I'm invoking Jesus. I'm wanting Jesus to save me. There is a huge difference in the mentality of the Muslim who does these actions versus the Christian who goes to Jesus Christ. You see my point here? So if you listen to that lecture, I will do that. I will explain. And the red line to me, like I said, is the kalima. So if you, and that's why it's the kalima. I mean, that's why it's the foundation, isn't it, right? That's exactly why. So anybody who believes in a prophet other than the Prophet ﷺ, that is a red line for me, after. And anybody who believes in a God other than Allah, that is a red line for me. Is that clear? Other than this, you can strongly disagree. And I do, and I said this. It is haram to ask the dead for your needs. I said this. If you disagree, that's my opinion. You follow your opinion, but it's my opinion. You don't ask the dead for your needs. It is theology that is leading you towards shirk, but it is not shirk in and of itself. Is that clear? I appreciate your questions, and inshallah, if you listen, I have so many lectures on that. If you listen, inshallah, all of this has been, this is my topic. I love this topic. These types of, my expertise, by the way, is theology, but because of modernity, I've been forced to talk about Islam in modernity, and it is also an area I like. But my actual expertise, my PhD expertise is theology. Then after that, it is hadith and seerah and ulum al-Quran. Then after that, topics of modernity and whatnot. So your topic, I can talk hours and hours, but I can't because our... one last question. I mean, how can I choose? They're all going to get into that. Khalas, she has the mic. I like this. Yes. I have the mic. There are two mics. So there are two valid opinions. We should respect both opinions. Okay. These are the final two questions. Where's the other mic? Right here. So we have two mics. Bismillah. We are first. Bismillah.
Okay, Assalamualaikum. I was listening to your talk online and I came specifically to ask you these questions. So I have two questions. First of all, we do see that these two extremes that you talked about feed off each other. And I also feel that in parenting, you see children of extremely religious people turning towards atheism and whatnot, and you see children of liberal people turning towards religion. So I want to ask you, in your experience with dealing with the chaos that you've seen in America is now coming in our society with YouTube and apps and games and video games and whatnot. So from a parenting perspective, what is the successful strategy to make your kids, I don't want them to be atheists or addicts, but I don't want them to be fanatics either. So what is the parenting strategy that would really keep them in the middle, solid ground? And my second question is that Muslims all over the world are suffering, especially in Palestine, in Kashmir, and we see that on YouTube, we see that on news daily. So why do you think that nation state, such as Pakistan or other nation states which have the military and political power are not united, are totally disunited to address these issues, where Muslims are being killed, raped, murdered every day, bombed every day, and we have nuclear weapons sitting in our countries and we're not helping our brother Muslims?
MashaAllah, the second question was very blunt and to the point. Your first question, see, once again, I don't want to project my experiences onto Pakistan. I was born in America, raised in America, my children are in America, so I have a very different background and experience. I don't want to project it onto your society because I haven't really lived here. But I will say one thing, that I have noticed that you are absolutely right, that there is this yo-yo effect, vacillating. Many times, those that were born in extremely irreligious households, their children become extremely fanatical. Actually, you're aware, you all know ISIS, right? You all know ISIS, it's a terrorist group. 10 years ago, there was a problem in Western lands of youth leaving the country and joining ISIS. Okay, we had thousands of people from Europe and around 1,000 from America. But from Europe, there were thousands that were born in wealthy families, like, upper middle class, educated. And they're just overnight, they steal their father's credit card, buy it, and go there. So, and I was a professor at the time, so I had access to a lot of research and whatnot. I'm still a professor in Maori, but I was in a university back then, Rhodes College. One thing that we saw over and over again was invariably, like 99% of the people that joined these groups came from extremely irreligious families. They weren't practicing Islam as youth. And they discovered Islam as young adults, and they went from 0 not to 100 but to 1,000 in one day. And they jumped from quite literally night clubbing and drinking and gambling and women and whatnot to becoming ultra fanatical and then joining ISIS and doing some crazy things and bombing and whatnot, right? Multiple times this was the norm. And I was actually back in the day invited to communities from parents who were so worried about their children going down this route to speak to them and whatnot. And one thing we noticed, you hardly ever found a child who was raised in a moderately religious family, healthy religion, ever embracing those ideals. Very interesting, right? And of course we understand why. That those who don't see what real religion is, they construct a fake religion. Those who haven't experienced the real love of Islam and whatnot, they think that utopia is the only way forward, and they believe in a utopia. So the best way forward is, and I know this sounds so cliche, but wallahi, this is my own experiences and the experiences of my family and friends around me, is to demonstrate Islam to your children in your lived life, not in your lectures to them. This is the best way. You need to live the values you want to pass down to your children. They need to see Islam in the family household, because here's a psychological phenomenon. Well known, you guys are the experts, I'm not the expert here. You guys are the experts in these sciences. Surveys show, simple example, of men who physically abuse their wives, domestic abuse, predominantly come from marriages where their own fathers would abuse their mothers. You understand what I'm saying here, right? Physical abuse, discipline, whatnot. Surveys and studies show that a higher than normal percentage of these men come from households where that occurred. Now, when I first read this statistic like 10 years ago, I was like scratching my head, like, one would think that a young man who sees his father abuse his mother, I mean, I speak to the men here, as a 14-year-old, 15-year-old, hypothetically you saw this, who would you side with, men? Where would your heart go to? Men. The mother, instinctively, like that's our nature. So how can a young man who has seen this then become one? And then of course, I'm not a sociologist, of course it's obvious. He knows up here it's wrong, but he's seen and absorbed what you should do when you're angry, acting it out. So when he becomes the 35-year-old that his father once was, and he becomes angry, up here he knows it's wrong, but his hands and his tongue and his feet will do what he has seen his father do. This is the reality of human psychology, that unfortunately, actions speak louder than words when it's negative, and also when it's positive, fortunately. So my generic advice, cliched advice, but it is so true, live the life you want your children to follow. Don't just preach to them, because children are going to go through a phase, and I've seen this anecdotally as well, in America especially in the teenage and college years, university years. The default is they're going to stray left and right. It's the default. I mean, you guys are at the prime and pinnacle of your youth and your manhood or femininity, and hormones are at your peak and whatnot. And that's why, by the way, the Prophet ﷺ said that 7 are the people whom Allah shelters on the day there is no shelter other than the shelter. One of them is a young man or woman who remains firm in the way of Allah. If you can be a good Muslim at this age, you're set for life. You're not going to go astray when you're 50, 60. If you can 21-year-old, 25-year-old, and you're praying 5 times a day of one of the major sins, mashallah, then Allah is happy with you and you're going to be inshallah, generally speaking, right? So, what was I saying? Absorbing the values of your parents by their lifestyles. Anecdotally, I have seen that even if young men and women go astray for a period of time, when they get married and have their own kids, they revert to the household they grew up in. And if that household was good religion, they become good religious. You know, I grew up in the 80s. Wallahi, there were kids that they did stuff, I could have sworn, qasam, they're never going to be religious folks. But their parents were good people. And now, mashallah, they're on the boards of the masajid, they're on taking care of the Sunday school. They came back, despite those 5-10 years of completely lost. Because it's human nature. For how long will you be astray before your soul says, you know what, I need to correct. And when it corrects to what it knows. So that's my generic advice. Your second question is very, very blunt and controversial, and I don't see the need to be too explicit here. But I'll go back to the question about Islamic governance versus personal spirituality. And I'll say to you bluntly, what can I do about this reality? How can I change that reality? Kya kar sakta hu main? Whereas, can I change the reality of my family and friends to be better Muslims? Can I influence my Christian neighbor to be positive of Islam? So why worry about the unreachable when there's so much that is reachable right now? You see my point here? I'm not trying to dismiss the question, but what I find is that for some, I'm not saying you, for some people, such discussions become a panacea, blaming everything on the higher ups when they can't correct themselves and their families. Okay, maybe the higher ups are at fault. I don't know, maybe they are. But there's an anecdote that comes to mind. Have you heard of Hajjaj ibn Yusuf? The worst tyrant of early Islam. He killed Sahaba and Tabi'un. One of the worst Fir'auns of the Ummah, right? There's an anecdote that's found in the books of history that a group of young men went to Hassan al-Basri, said, why don't you speak against Hajjaj? Why don't you fight Hajjaj? There's going to be an insurrection. There was an actual physical insurrection. You know, we're going to join and whatnot. And so Hassan al-Basri allegedly said, O young boys, O young men, one ghiba that you have done will bring you more distress on the Day of Judgment than all the blood of Hajjaj. Later on, those young men joined the insurrection and they were all killed. And Hassan al-Basri said, may Allah forgive them, but what have they accomplished? You see my point here? Hajjaj is Hajjaj. I can't do anything about Hajjaj. But on the Day of Judgment, one sin I have done will bring me more distress than all the blood of Hajjaj. So I'm not apolitical. I'm actually very political if you listen to my lectures. I'm not a pacifist, but I'm a pragmatist. Let's emphasize more what we can do rather than the what ifs if other people did. You see my point here? And there are some people, by the way, who are indeed in a position to influence the what ifs and the higher ups. They should worry about influencing the higher ups. Maybe you are a Secretary General somewhere. Maybe you are in close contact with some minister somewhere. Then yes, you influence. But if you're like me or everybody else who has no contact with those big guys or whatnot, then mind what your own business is actually capable of doing and emphasize that, and you will actually be productive in that regard. You see what I'm saying? In this regard, okay? But
this is articulated by
Raz who says, शिकवे ज़ुल्मत शब से तो कहीं बेहतर था अपने हिस्से की क्षमा जला.
I kind of get that, yeah. Okay, mashallah. Last question. Where is our...
Over here.
Okay, bismillah.
Okay, so I'm going to begin with a very short comment. Thank you very much for a lovely talk. My short comment pertains to the one thing that you said, that nobody, no religious scholar is asking to bring back slavery, the institution of slavery, for example. And to that I want to welcome you to Pakistan, where you'll actually find scholars who want to welcome the institution of slavery, and they'll be saying, oh, you know what, we want an Islamic state, and we're going to attack such and such place, and we're going to get slaves out of it. So,
okay, I wasn't aware of that. I wasn't aware of that. It could be, okay.
Yeah, but obviously I'm not asking you to respond to that. I'd like you to respond to, again, the question about the nation state. In your personal opinion, in today's world, does it make sense to have laws of the type that distinguish between the religion of the people? So, for example, a person who's not a Muslim in a Muslim majority country cannot be chief minister or prime minister or president.
So I don't feel qualified to make a global verdict on this. I really think this is a culturally specific question, and it should be answered by the locals of every single region differently. The Sharia allows for diversity. Why do we think that these difficult questions must have only one answer that is entirely global? If even the minutiae of fiqh can vary from region to region, what do you think about the actual grandiose schemes of how to run a country? So I don't feel qualified to answer this question at a global level. And I fully understand that in some countries, this might be an ideal that they might try to strive for, even though I say, I don't know how they would do that given the reality of the nation state. That how can you actually enforce a hierarchy of different nationalities? I don't know, maybe some countries do it. By the way, okay, I'm not living in your country, so I never claim to, I am Pakistani ethnically, but I've never lived in the country. I'm not saying that's wrong. I'm not saying that's universally right. And I'm not saying that just to be PC, by the way. I'm literally believing that in some areas and lands, it might be in the best interest, and in some areas and lands, it doesn't make sense to do so. What is best for your country is something the people that are born and raised here, living here, should discuss amongst themselves. So what is possible in Egypt or impossible in Egypt is not the same as what is possible or impossible in Pakistan. I mean, let's, again, simplistic reality. Egypt was Coptic 100%. The ancient Egyptians were all Coptic. You cannot equate Pakistan, that was meant to be a Muslim state. I'm just speaking as a neutral person, even though I'm Pakistani. You cannot expect that post-partition India, when Jinnah and others had the vision that we need our Muslim majority state for Muslims, right? The only nation state that was literally founded in the name of a religion. This is something that is unique, and I'm not saying this in order to endorse one opinion. I'm just being factually correct here. Is it not the case that the only nation state in the postmodern world, in post-World War II, and ever in human history, that's its literal, raison d'etre for founding was that we want to have a nation run for and by people of the Islamic faith. I understand with that premise, some would argue, let's live up to those ideals. I understand that they would say we should have some laws in place. And I understand the pushback and say, hold on a sec, it doesn't make sense and we can't make an exception for Pakistan. I'm not in a position to act as a judge between the two. But I will tell you, in my humble opinion, Islamic political science would allow for both of these opinions to be valid in two different places. Do you understand what I'm saying here? That both could be argued for from within the Islamic paradigm. And what is permissible in Egypt, for the Islamic party to say, yeah, well, we can't really ban anybody. Because Egypt has a history of Coptic Christians. They predate Islam in terms of, them being there. So for them to understand, okay, we have to give you guys equality, might be different than, I don't know what you're referring, by the way, so just in case somebody reads and I really don't know what he's referring, I'm just speaking generically, because I don't want to cause any issues when I come to Pakistan. I'm just saying, I can understand from a fiqhi perspective, siyasa sharia perspective, you could defend that we want a level of purity to the faith for those in government, given the dynamics of a certain region, and another region can say we cannot have that level of purity. You understand what I'm saying here? Okay, so I'm being ambivalent, and I'm saying it is within the realm of fiqh to allow local cultures to negotiate this, given the different times and parameters of their realities.
يا من أجبت دعاء نوح فانتصر وحملته في فلكك المشحون يا من أحال النار حول خليله روحا وريحانا بقولك كوني